All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, as I've said here many times in moments of crisis, there are a few people that I look to help me process what's going on. Obviously, Crystal, a few select recurring guests are on that list. But the other is New York Times columnist Ross Douthat. Ross has always been one of the most thoughtful and important people within the burgeoning anti-establishment right, who calls it like he actually sees it, and he very rarely overreaches. Which is why when I read his most recent column, I took it so seriously that I wanted to process it with all of you. Ross's latest column is titled, quote, "How the Republican Party Could Break." He thankfully points out that many liberals have always predicted this. Post-George W. Bush, post-Obama, post-2012, somehow the party continued to claw back and even win the presidency just a few years later. But in light of the events at the Capitol, Ross points to a new central breaking point, which is, quote, "not a normal ideological division or an argument about strategy or tactics, but a split between reality and fantasy that may be uniquely hard for either self-interest or statesmanship to bridge." This is a really important point because it requires to understand who Republicans are exactly in the Trump era. It's a coalition, much like its Democratic counterpart, that is full of contradictions. It has sizable minority support after the 2020 election. It has suburban elements. It has increasingly more white working class voters. And overwhelmingly, it is becoming more rural, downwardly mobile, and less educated. As you all know, I think there's a central class element at play. But obviously, that is not the entire story. The truth is that after 2020, the only thing that each parts of the Republican coalition have in common with one another is hating the left. Wealthy suburbanites hate the left over taxes. A small but important minority segment rejects identity politics. Others are afraid of defund the police. And the evangelicals are fighting to replace Roe versus Wade, so on and so forth. It's a party built upon rejection more than it embraces anything. Now, don't get me wrong, this can be very powerful and was proven by Trump. It can also win elections from time to time. But Trump's latest dabbling in Stop the Steal, as Ross points out, could truly be the end. Why? Because, quote, "the implicit bargain of the Trump era required traditional Republicans, from upper-middle-class suburbanites to the elites of the Federalist Society, to live with a lot of craziness from their leaders, and a lot of even crazier ideas from the very online portions of his base, in return for denying Democrats the White House, and it's not clear that this bargain can survive the eruption of all that crazy into the halls of the Capitol. The worst part of the scenario is this. The battle lines are not ones that I want to fall on either side of, and I don't think most people do either. On one hand, there are those who want to repudiate Trump's actions and any policy that he stood for, to the extent that he did. You get the idea. People like Mitt Romney and Lisa Murkowski or Liz Cheney, they want to reject Trump, the man, and Trump's inclinations to at least try or speak out against forever wars in Afghanistan, Trump's pledge not to touch Social Security, his pledges on trade and immigration and so on, expanding American infrastructure. Rejecting Trump, the man, is not enough to these people. They must also reject the underlying policy. As Peter Spilakios puts it, that non-Trumpy GOP defined by Liz Cheney and gentry conservatism, like tax cuts for all, which opposes common sense and massively popular stuff like coronavirus relief bills, and nothing else, is just another fantasy politics, which makes the triumph of the Q fantasy even more likely. I completely agree with this. And that's why it's troubling, because the people who want to, at least in name, say what happened was wrong at the Capitol and Trump is very much to blame are the very same ones who want to continue to rob you and the rest of the country blind. And yet, on the other side, there are people who literally don't live in reality. In their reality, the election was stolen. You're a moron if you don't believe that some random Twitter account which claims to have run some sophisticated statistical analysis is true. And yet, on a policy level, they're also the people most amenable to my critiques of the elite-driven system. They're the ones, at least in rhetoric, are against forever wars. They're the ones who have no problem standing up against Wall Street, and they're not sold out to China. And yet, as evidenced by the riots on Capitol Hill, none of that is going to matter if the people are also so crazy that they're willing to riot or try to tacitly support trying to overthrow the U.S. Capitol building and kill a sitting vice president. Worse, it's not like politicians who share that policy worldview can co-opt it. Look at Josh Hawley's attempt to thread the needle. He tried to go highbrow Stop the Steal to try and redirect this insane energy towards his political ambitions with the likely rationalization that he was doing it for a better purpose, to use their energy to enact real reforms if he ever eventually got into office. And I think we all know how that worked out. As I said here at the time, going highbrow stop the steal will get you nothing. The people who really believe this stuff, which is a large segment of our population, aren't there for decertifying election results based upon some objections on Pennsylvania election law. They are there for Sidney Powell and Lynn Wood and Venezuelan conspiracy theories and more. That's the truth. Just got to recognize it. So there you have it. Future is bleak. I fully believe now that Stop the Steal has so deeply penetrated the Republican DNA, it is as much of an article of faith to the voting base as Russiagate is to the Democrats. Maybe more. It is a delusion set so deeply within, it will be the main point on which someone is judged in a primary by the latter group I talked about. It obscures any policy debate whatsoever. And worse, the only people who will speak out against it are the neocons who want to blame Trump for the state of the country that they also left us with. Few are left to work to better the country. The left isn't going to abandon its total commitment to rigid cultural liberalism anytime soon. And what's left? Meaningless gridlock in Congress, pointless culture war fights over what inane controversy will get cooked up under Joe Biden, and the further enrichment of elites and China and everyone else who is working to weaken this country. And if I sound depressed, it's because I am. I want to try and be honest with you about where we are, because I think it is the only way that we might be able to move forward, at least sometime in the future. The events at the Capitol last week really are a turning point. They are not to be minimized. They offer such obvious and important lessons to anyone who wants to live in an actually stable country. The trouble we have, as we always have, is that it's much easier to point the finger at one another than it is to sit down and say, how the hell did this happen? And maybe one day we will get there. But in the meantime, I expect major tensions within the Republican coalition, if not an outright break, and a left that will be hell-bent on revenge, not unjustly so from their perspective, and more division at a time when we've needed unity more than ever. That's kind of where I see it right now, Crystal. Especially, it's funny, in the context of the impeachment vote, it's all breaking along the lines that I lay out here, like McConnell and Liz Cheney on this one side, and then Marjorie Greene Taylor and others. Like, I've seen Marjorie Greene Taylor say some things on trade that I agree with, but she's also like a QAnon person. Right. So I'm like, well, what do you do?
There's no one really to side with. Yeah.
Josh Hawley, and people here know I like Josh Hawley. I liked a lot of the things that he said. And then he went against the election results, and he's going to be branded with that for the rest of his career. And to the extent that he stood for a policy on anything, in terms of advancing that in the GOP and the mainstream, it's dead. It's over for him, right? Yeah. He will never be able to do any of that.
It's true.
And then, you have a few bright spots and others who are, didn't do that. But to the extent that they have the power in order to overcome the establishment, I don't see that. I actually think this could break. I think this could break it because as you see with Liz Cheney and Mitt Romney and Susan Collins and all that, they can get elected. They are not majoritarian whatsoever within the Republican Party, but they have their, place. And then the worst part is that if that's a moderating influence, that means the further success of the QAnon folks. That's probably 32-something% of the country. I'm not saying they believe in QAnon, but they'd be more adjacent to QAnon and really just like Q adjacent and just like hating liberals so much that they'll literally vote for anyone who's like, these people are the devil. Right. That's how you win a Republican primary, by the way.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Trump could have polarized the country along any number of lines, right? He could have polarized it. And this was the hope and the most ambitious promise of his administration was that he would polarize it along the lines of, say, trade or the relationship with China or infrastructure or a more populist economics, right?
Correct.
Healthcare for all. He talked about that some on the campaign trail. Like, all of these things were in the range of possibility, or even just anti-corruption or anti-elite. There were any number of issues that he could have decided to polarize the country on. And he decided, ultimately, as his final act, that he was going to make the real litmus test
himself
and a complete willingness to deny objective reality, right? And because that is such a toxic place to stand, that has made it intolerable for elites in this country, as I was talking about on my radar, to continue to go along with it. So that forces a choice, right? I think especially, and I wonder what you think about this, I think especially if they vote to convict him, which I know you think is very unlikely. I also think it's unlikely, but give it more of a chance, I think, than you do. If that happens, I think that split becomes even more more likely. And then you have, two groups, neither of which have sufficient numbers in order to govern, and you have, really a sort of collapse of one of the two major parties in America. I don't think it's unlikely that would happen, right? You would still bet against it because, as you said, and as Ross points out, we've been at these kind of junctures before where it looked like that coalition couldn't possibly cohere anymore. And everybody involved kind of just decides, look, if I want to continue to get elected, we got to put these pieces back together somehow and muddle through. And they've managed to muddle through for a long time now. That's still what you would bet would happen here. But this is a more significant break than we've ever seen before. And the other piece of this that I worry about, and you're talking about the aftermath of the riots last week, like, a lot of the commentary that I saw was so, it's like talking about the waist size and the clothing choices and the diet choices of the people that were. It's just total contempt, right? It's just utter and complete contempt. Yeah. And like, look, people, this is not letting anybody off the hook. People should be judged and prosecuted and all that stuff, right? But it consolidates the power of anti-populists who now have another weapon in their arsenal to say, look at these stupid, crazy, conspiratorial, violent masses out there. We can't possibly give these people more power. We can't possibly allow them to govern. And so, in the incoming neoliberal administration, it gives them another tool to wield to say, look, we got to bring in the experts. We got to get the elites back in charge of this place. And they find willing allies in people like Romney, McConnell, et cetera, and ultimately making that anti-populist case.
I'm glad you said that because it's important. They truly hate their fellow citizens, hate them with contempt, and they have the power in order to impress them. And here's why I actually think this will happen, is that Kamala, if it was Kamala or Pete, you could still win a backlash election to cultural liberalism and or some, just a truly this is Joe Biden. I mean, nobody thinks Joe Biden is going to defund the police. They just don't. Nobody thinks that Joe Biden is going to do Medicare for all. They truly don't. They don't think he's going to go and fulfill any of the ambitions of the burgeoning left. And I know you don't like that, but I'm saying in terms of backlash politics, that is how a Republican could ever win, unite all of these coalitions together. And to the extent that they did against Trump, it was because with Hillary, they were like, this person is odious. This isn't because they thought she was far left. They're they just hated her and thought she was odious and would bring even more neoliberalism. But that's what you need on the right to win an election currently, at least currently constituted. That's not going to be Joe Biden. I don't think he's going to do that. I think he is going to pass $2,000 checks, especially now that the Democrats have a narrow but marginal control of the Senate. The types of things they're going to get through, I think, are broadly going to be popular and popular, with some crossover Republican support. Distributing a vaccine will be very popular. I think the Democrats will have a 65 to 70% approval rating in 2021 and 2022, and we're going to have a booming economy. So in that context, how can they survive? They have to break because it will be the election was stolen, and then the McConnell and Liz Cheney folks were like, no, it's not. We have to do tax cuts and forever wars all over again, and there will be no reconciliation, especially if they get a crushing loss in the 2022 midterms, which now looks very likely. Look, maybe you'll play this clip, make fun of me again, but we'll see.
Never underestimate, in the words of Barack Obama, the ability of Joe Biden to screw things up, to F things up, in his words. He's not known for managerial competence, so you don't want to take for granted that he will roll out the vaccine effectively. But Ron Klain actually is known for managerial competence, so they have a decent shot. And the initial rollout has been so poor, the bar has been set extraordinarily low. The economy, once the vaccine's in place, is going to come roaring back. So, there's a good chance here that Biden and the neoliberal Democrats are going to be in a very dominant position.
I think that's right.
Next on Rising, editor-in-chief at The Real News and host of Working People podcast, Max Alvarez, and also Capitol Hill reporter at The Daily Caller, Henry Rogers. They're going to join us for our panel. That when Rising returns.